Now, as many of you probably do know, some of you may not know, this session was very much the brainchild of Don White, who, again, some of you may have met Don earlier. He's sort of been around during the day. Some of you may not. But he's a PhD student here in the Department of History, working with Bain on late 15th, early 16th century sort of wood carving, materiality, sort of parish religion, craftsmanship, those sorts of things. He'll be giving a paper sort of related to his research in one of the sessions tomorrow. Unfortunately, because he was, as Bayat mentioned yesterday, he was involved in a nasty accident, so he's not able to be here and to run this session now. So Joanne and I are sort of going to share the chairmanship of this. As Don isn't here, I thought it might be nice to begin just by reading what he wrote about this session. He very much sort of set the tone, the scope, the aims of what this roundtable is about. So although you all have this in your book of abstracts, let me just sort of read out the brief text that he sort of compiled around this. European parish studies is relentlessly forward-looking. Practitioners are necessarily cross-disciplinary in their approaches and committedly so in their interests. The field as a whole has actively, if not presciently, engaged with broad topics including local identities, cultural exchange, space and atmosphere, the body, emotions, sensory perception, the landscape, materiality, lived religion, and the list could go on. Recent contributions, while retaining their essential specialist orientation, interweave art history, archaeology, and material culture-based approaches with social, cultural, and religious history, cultural studies, and anthropology. All this makes parish studies something of a laboratory for the pressing issues and emergent methodologies at the fore of discourses on the pre-modern European past. The concentrated scholarly activity in this area over just the last 10 years speaks to the pace at which parish studies has evolved, and that shows no signs of slowing. However, parish studies is also a field deeply invested in active local cultures and their living heritage. Further progress in scholarship cannot fail to account for the implications of this privileged and profoundly challenging position. This session aims to address the delicate balance by bringing together a group of early career academics and postgraduate students from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds to participate in a roundtable on the onward directions and ethical considerations of the next decade of parish studies. Discussion will centre on a whole range of things, but questions of the field's wider effects outside the confines of academe. How do we bridge the divide between university academics and other groups attentive to aspects of pre-modern parish life? What opportunities and what responsibilities come with our shared interests in past communities that exist in the present and, with proper attention and support, will continue to exist in the future?
Yes, so the format that we're going to try and take at the moment here is that we are very kind young scholars here today are going to give just a brief word about their interests in parish studies now, just to take a testing of the waters here about where parish studies is going to go tomorrow, which I think is a really, really lovely opportunity here to share their new projects in amongst this wealth of experience that we actually have in this room today, really, truly interdisciplinary. So we're going to invite them each to give a little introduction to what they're doing and their interests here, and then what we're going to do is just sort of open it up to general discussions, themes that are coming out of the conference over the weekend so far, and to invite you all just to start having a dialogue. You've listened to so much over so far that we thought it would be really nice to try and get as much conversation going as possible and just have a bit of free form. But we'll have a bit of commentary about themes that have come out. Jonathan, I felt, we've been at different sessions very much, so we'll be able to see the common strands, the emerging strands that you have all raised so far in your own presentations and workshops, which I think can really inspire us for parish studies and the health of parish studies for tomorrow. So I don't know where to pick on anybody, but who's feeling brave that they would like to maybe start? I don't want to. Matt, will you be? Thank you very much indeed.
So, hello everybody, I'm Matthew Jackson. I've spoken to a few of you already, but I'm a second year doctoral research student here at Warwick, supervised by Professor Bear Cooming and Dr. Penny Roberts. And I'm working on a project entitled Drink and Identity, a comparative case study of early modern Bristol and Bordeaux. And it's basically trying to broadly explore the relationships between alcohol and identity formation. So not just the identities of individuals within drinking houses, but the collective identities, ecclesiastical and civic identities that are focused and produced through drink. So that's a very brief synopsis.
Agata, would you like to?
Okay, yeah. So my name is Agata, and graduated in January from Warwick. I did my master's in history of art, and well, I was invited here because I'm very, very new to parish studies, and this all happened rather by chance. That wasn't intended at all. Last year around this time, I had to kind of choose the topic of my dissertation, and I was very confused, as Donald Cooper, who supervised me, can confirm. And I knew that I was interested in the apotropaic heads on buildings in Venice, because I was lucky enough to be able to study in Venice for 3 months. And so obviously, as I started to work on the topic, I began to link the heads and their interesting aesthetics, the interesting looks. I linked them to their contexts, and this topic had a very, very interdisciplinary potential, and my supervisors much encouraged me to pursue on that. And so I looked at the social history surrounding the buildings on which the sculptures were, and also, well, there are a lot of different fields that I tried to put together in my dissertation, and well, my case studies happened to be on Venetian parish churches. And so this is how I got into the parish field. Yeah.
And they're pursuing forward. We can return to these things as well. Yes,
yeah, Susan?
I know it's counterintuitive to be called an early scholar at my age, but I just finished a PhD supervised by Dr. Tara Hamlin on a comparison of the use of levels, English parish churches, Scottish kirks, and English private chapels between 1560 and 1640. And I enjoyed it so much that I persuaded Dr. Willis and Dr. Hamlin to supervise me for a PhD, and I'm going to look at just parish churches and their interiors in the same time, 1560 to 1640, and ask the question, what were the influences that drove changes to the interiors of parish churches in those 80 years?
Hello, I'm Kristi Bain. I'm in the Department of Religious Studies at Northwestern University, and I'm a PhD student. I'm just starting my research this year, and I'll be coming to the UK in September for a full year, to conduct a full year of research, so looking forward to that. But Dawn in particular asked me to come to talk a little bit about, I have a project that's quite interdisciplinary, but I'm focusing particularly on what the parish church looks like through the lens of religious studies. More specifically, I'm thinking about the way that I can employ notions of lived religion. My department, the Department of Religious Studies at Northwestern, is very interdisciplinary, so we're well versed in spatial theory, cultural theory, sociology, but I'm particularly influenced by Robert Orsi's definition of lived religion. He's an American scholar, actually he studies modern American religion. But he calls lived religion, or religion itself, quote, a network of relationships between heaven and earth involving humans of all ages and many different sacred figures together. And that has also influenced me to bring together the medieval parish with the modern parish. So when I think of religion as lived in the parish church, it's how it's lived in the medieval era, but how modern parishioners link their own concept of modern churchmanship to their medieval past. So there's a lot more that I can say about that, but for now, that notion of lived religion is what I'm bringing to parish studies.
That's great. Thank you very much to all our brave delegates here to to share with us the beginnings of their research, and I'm sure they'll be happy to discuss more as things develop here, because it was just a very brief introduction to their researches. So we'll obviously be inviting further questions. Hopefully you will be interested in hearing more about their projects and their approaches. But you can see here how very much they're tapping into the themes that Don outlined already, whether it's through the art and art history of parishes in Venice, it's the lived religion concept, and in changing interiors, sacred space, and identity and formation, and the effect of the parish beyond the parish church itself, about its collective communities through drinking culture, that actually the parish is not just the church as we know, it's everything that comprises within its boundaries. So, I mean, this is just a really nice moment just to be thinking about where we go next. To say, I was joking to Jonathan, saying that it's almost a rogation moment here, that we perhaps walk around our boundaries together, and maybe see that we can extend them or so on. But this is a really nice moment for us to feel like we're doing procession and reflection at this point in our festal weekend. So I think
so at that point, we'd really just like to invite people to chip in, be it with questions or comments or themes, things that you've observed so far, things that you'd like to comment on, questions that maybe you brought to the conference that haven't been answered yet and that you'd like to raise in this forum. Yeah.
Agata, I've got one for you. You very modestly failed to mention that you've just secured a funded PhD place at UEA. And having looked at your grotesque heads in the Venetian context, do you plan to extend that work into East Anglian churches? Are you going to do a comparative study, or do you see yourself going back to Venice to find more of the same? Where are you going?
Well, good question. Well, I am back in Venice now at the moment, and I'm going around and trying to look for more heads, but unfortunately I haven't found many more now. And well, the UEA accepted my proposal, which much focused on the medieval grotesque heads and very highly expressive human heads on buildings. I just presented them with some quite interesting case studies, which happen to be mostly 13th century French pieces, but also I found a few very interesting ones in England. And I had a chat with people from UEA and my future supervisor, Sandy Hessel, yesterday, and they told me already about the future trips that, they said that you're going to drag me around the churches in East Anglia, and I saw their presentation today, and I was really fascinated with, with the demonic figures on the angel roofs.
Yes.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to this. So I still need to kind of narrow down my topic, and I would love to look at everything that fascinates me, but there's just too much. So I think there will be some things from England and maybe something from France, but I'm not sure if I'll be able to go back to Venice to find some more. But I feel like I haven't actually finished my research in Venice, because I didn't have a chance to look at each parish individually. I kind of looked at it from this broader spectrum. And for example, I would like to go to Church of Santa Maria Formosa, and because I know the name of the designer of the bell tower, of the campanile, and I know that there's more to find out about this. And maybe somewhere there are a few words written about this amazing sculpture. So hopefully I'll be able to do that at some point. Yeah.
Okay.
I wonder if I sort of look at the panel. I mean, how many of you actively sort of define yourselves as sort of studying parishes? I mean, when you go out to non-parish conferences, do you say I'm a student of parishes, or do you think that's not sexy enough?
Well, I'm a drinking historian. You
Right.
can't
But I mean, Kristi, would you say I'm a historian of the parish, or would you sort of try and avoid that term when you explain what you do?
I don't avoid it, but it takes some explanation to an American audience sometimes what I mean by being a parish studies scholar, and that has particular meaning when I talk about English parishes. So I usually start out by saying I'm a medievalist. I'm studying, and I didn't get to tell you this because I had such a short time a little bit ago, but I'm looking, my point of departure is conflict in shared monastic parochial churches. So I'm doing archival work on the way that the parishioners are fighting the monks for shared space, and I'm thinking of that in terms of lived religion, probably more in the way of Gabriel Lebras' idea of lived religion, but then I'm looking at how those churches where conflicts existed look back to the conflict and use it as a way to encourage parishioners and volunteers and visitors to donate to the church or be more active in the church to restoring it. When I explain that, then they understand what parish studies means, and then I talk about it. But no, I wouldn't say I start out that way. But it's not because I don't think it's sexy enough, it's just conflict is a little sexier.
I mean, you probably would, or not.
Yeah, I'd say I'm studying parish churches. And that implied in that is that I'm studying the community around that, the parish around it and beyond. And the best way I can explain it is this wonderful thing I found in Wolverhampton, probably in Wolverhampton, when I was studying galleries, which was that there's a beautiful gallery in Wolverhampton, those of you who know the Collegiate Church of St. Peter. And it was built in 1610 by the merchant tailors, as probably some of you know. And they built it to resolve the most enormous row between the recusant parents of the children of the free school and the hapless schoolmaster called Barnes. And Barnes was having this great row with the parents, the recusant parents, because they wouldn't send in 1608 their children to church on Sundays. So he said, right, if you're not coming to church on Sundays, you can't come to the free school in the week. And the merchant tailors involved the equivalent of Ofsted. They sent for the Fellows of St John's, Oxford, which included Laud. They had, they involved the Archbishop of Canterbury. There were petitions against the hapless Barnes, 100 plus. Petitions for the hapless Barnes in the city of, in the town of Wolverhampton. And eventually the merchant tailors came up with this great idea. They built a gallery. They put the boys in the gallery. The recusant parents were so delighted to see their sons elevated that they sent them to church. Then the hapless barn was sacked, and the new schoolmaster had all full attendance in his school. So it resolved a fantastic row inside the community. And I'm really interested in the relationship, as many of you are, the relationship between what was going on inside the parish church and the wider community. And it was both a source of conflict and also a means of reconciliation. So that's a very long answer, sorry. But if you're ever in Wolverhampton, I know people tend to avoid it, but if you ever are, go and look at this wonderful gallery, 1610, built by the merchant tailors.
Perhaps we can invite the same question to Matt, actually. I think he feels
well, I suppose I'm very interested in drinking houses and the kind of activities that are going on inside them. So it's implicitly parish-related because they're all important social spaces fixed in a parish. I'm very interested in the relationship between the parish church and the drinking house. So even in the small parish where I live in Brentwood, there's the church, and literally less than a stone's throw away is the parish church right across the road. So these connections are very important. But I'm also looking at Bristol and Bordeaux, which are two massive urban centres. Bristol has 18 parishes, Bordeaux has 24. And when I'm comparing these two, I guess I'm losing a sense of, can I still call it a parish history when it's scaling up to that kind of level? So I'm liminal, I suppose, I'm in between.
A theme that Peter Marshall put Valerie and myself on the spot earlier by saying, how was the digital revolution in a sense, why could we not make our project? We think of new projects now, and we think of the applications of the digital world that's new available to us. Could you comment on your methods and how you think your research might be benefiting or not using aspects of the digital revolution?
Well, I just went to the National Archives last week, and it's thanks to their digitisation of the descriptions of the catalogues, I can literally say, right, this source is here, this source is here. The time that would have taken to go through the Star Chamber cases, that's fantastic. But you also lose that incidental reference, which you find by accident. So you lose that, the craft of history, I suppose, would be changing.
Yeah, also, I think you want to be very, very careful when you're trusting their catalogue online. It is, they say we are searching 11 million. If they said we're searching 111 million, I would be a lot happier.
Well, I actually corrected one of their references.
Only one?
Only one, yeah.
Please.
Don't scare me, please.
Please. Oh no, be very afraid.
It certainly raises up that issue as well, thinking about documents, the actual haptic experience of engaging with them. It's a discussion actually Sandra and I were having yesterday when she arrived, to do with the fact that often our contact with documents now is digitally, it's provided digitally even in the archive, and we're no longer allowed to have the original document, but that contact and that experience of being at the coalface, whether you're touching the document, you're in the church looking at the paintings, you're engaging in that sensory experience that we've been really working on here, particularly that the spiritual experience, hearing the bells ringing, the sense and that. So it's making sure that we actually engage in the senses, and that contact with that manuscript is quite important. They say not just for missing things, but for what it feels like to hold a document, and that connection it makes with the past is, I think, we can't forget that, and it's.
And it's not just you're missing that.
Yeah.
I think there has been a definite regression in that. The quality of some of the reproductions is so bad. There's a document that is legible in the original, is not legible online. And that is, I don't know what you do, because you're not allowed to see the original. And
we were talking about the time-consuming element of juggling the cursor around the bit you need to zoom in on, whereas previously you've got to come in with a magnifying glass. So it's just an addition to these complexities that are coming with the digital age.
This is wonderful. I love this utopian view. Anybody who stood in a church in February as the light goes, and the church warden is there rattling the keys, and you need another half an hour. Oh, for a digital camera to take some photographs like the ones Miriam was showing this morning, which are better than you see with your eye. Yes, be there. Yeah. Have the whole feely looky experience, but you do the work when you're home and it's on your desk, and you're away from the distractions of the key rattling church warden. I think they need both, frankly.
Well, yes, both definitely. After I paid my dues. I stood out in Alpine churches where the point I can't feel my feet anymore, and it's torture in some ways. But then when we're recording, we're also experiencing spatial placement, and absolutely, I then take them home and enjoy those zoom-ins, the powerful zoom-ins, which are amazing. We are certainly enjoying privileges now that we couldn't be part of. Jenny's a great corrective as always.
During February is an acquired taste.
Yes. Well, I have to say, actually being outside of Turin during the January-February snowstorm in Italy, the worst one they've had in 40 years, and that's when I choose to go and do my field research. Enough for me. Please.
I do you think that the sorts of online resources that are becoming, or have become available in the past sort of decade or so and are coming online, things like EBO, things like state papers online, things like that some of us sort of come to rely on, do they shape the sort of projects that people coming up are doing? Do they actually steer people away from things like parish studies because there are emphases on printed material, on central government, on other sorts of sources, and actually a lot of the stuff that people in this room are interested in is still really only accessible in local archives up and down county record offices in various places, or are there actually sort of digital tools that allow us to get around that, those sorts of limitations, like the project that Andrew and Valerie were talking about this morning?
One of the consequences of people accessing material online is the falling number of people going to county record offices, and that's being used as evidence now for members of county councils to make quite stiff cuts. So it's going to be an increasing problem, possibly, in the opening hours, so it's difficult because some record offices are only in the afternoon, which is a hopeless industry to do a long period of research. And most record offices in England now close at least 1 day a week. So and that's a consequence of general lack of footfall. Because people can access things too much online.
I think part of the problem too is people coming to a point where they think if it's not online, it doesn't exist.
Yes.
I mean, about 10 years ago, there was a project that I was involved with called Access to Archives A2A, which actually opened up a lot of small and local archives to people in a way that had never been possible before, and actually it caused a huge increase in people visiting and knowing that there was going to be something there when they got there. But I think it is coming to the point, I mean, with my own children's schoolwork, you know, if it's not on the internet, it doesn't exist, you know. More worryingly, if it is on the internet, it must be true. But the expectation, particularly with some of the huge projects being funded by people like Google, is that, you know, if it's not digital, it just simply doesn't exist. And so I think a lot of amateur historians are, and particularly people coming through the family history route, coming up through things like Ancestry and things like that, you know, are just assuming that if they can't find it on that it simply doesn't exist. And that because a lot of the material that has been digitised has not included any idea of scale, that when people do see the real thing, they're sometimes either completely, well, occasionally completely blown away, but quite often disappointed because it's hard to read or it's very small, and what they've seen on screen is, you know, quite a large image or a detail from an image, and the detail gets reproduced, and they don't realise that actually that detail may be, you know, a half-inch square illuminated initial in a book of hours, and not an A4 size colour image. So I think, you know, in terms of things digital, we're still slightly in sort of Wild West age of, you know, stuff just gets put up slightly at random, and that's creating both a level of understanding and misunderstanding that, you know, we should be putting some effort into addressing.
The other end of using digital technologies is the processing and analysing, and the computer power and the databases that we can use as analytical tools that help us to handle material we're getting, so which is definitely an advantage, particularly for the less numerate amongst us, to be able to put it into Excel and get it to do it for me, and that sort of thing. So there are definitely tool advantages.
It's friend and foe, isn't it? It's just got to be handled with
yes,
care.
An example of the very best is what's been done at the Warwick, and that has really revolutionised the access to the case papers. Because now you search, you put in peacock, and it will find all the variants of spelling of peacock, and it will give you all the cases involving someone called Peacock, and a problem of how do you tithe a peacock. And this is, which was an actual case, and it has been done extraordinarily well, and is open online, and you do not have to subscribe, and you do not have to persuade your university to pay enormous amounts of money for it. And their keyword system and everything is a model for.
Yes, it's very commendable, that liberation.
Yeah.
Yes, I do think actually the historical world has been far too uncritical of much of what is put out in digitised form. There have not been nearly enough complaints and calls for better quality in the way in which these costly still processes take place. One could trace a whole history of misspent monies from which we all suffer. And I would go back to the, was it even Public Record Office so long ago when the PCC wills were digitised and indexed, and a firm of people who were unable to read anything earlier than 1700 was brought in, and no complaints were made. I once spoke to the former chief executive at Kew, who said that it was in fact the thing they had most complaints about in her time in the form of letters from the public. But there were not enough for the National Archives to contemplate redoing it, nor that it really made them think that they should have done it differently. A2A I see in a similar way, in that for A2A, anyone engaged in historical research is likely to want to be able to focus on a search by date. The people who organise A2A at one time began to feel that they were getting complaints from researchers, and they brought in a method where you got a date-specific search facility because if you tapped in a date that you wished to search, instead of getting the date range of the entire archive, which is what you did get at the beginning and do get today, you could get things where the date occurred within 100 characters of your keyword, something like that. And that was a good idea. It wasn't perfect, but it sort of worked. But there wasn't enough enthusiasm for it, I think, and so it faded away. And then A2A itself was never really debated or discussed within the researching world, and local authorities lost enthusiasm. They have to pay a certain amount of money to put their records into it, and it's all begun to disintegrate in that different local authorities now put their records onto the site of their own county. So what seemed a wonderful national resource, far ahead of what you can get in France, for instance, has run out of steam.
Or run out of cash.
Run out of cash, but it was the local authorities who began contributing after the HLF monies ran out. I think had the various historical bodies shown more interest, perhaps of a slightly critical sort at times, they could have got an improved product. And if we don't make a fuss about what we want, we will just get what is served up. And that may be fine for people who are purely wanting to trace their ancestry, but if we're wanting to do anything more than that, we shan't be able to.
I think the whole sort of digital humanities issue is obviously a really interesting one, and one that we all sort of grapple with. But I was really interested by Bayat's question to the panel about self-identification, about sort of parish studies as an identifiable discipline. I think it would be interesting just to throw that actually back at everybody in the room. Are people brave enough to raise your hands if you consider yourself, if you would self-describe, self-identify as a historian of parish studies or as a parish studies sort of practitioner as your sort of primary identity? Well, that's really interesting. I mean, first of all, it would maybe be nice if some of you would comment as to why you feel that to be the case.
Because I'm not. I mean, there were parishes in the town that I studied, but parishes are not my primary concern.
Did you put your hand up?
No, I didn't.
So I was talking to that.
Oh, sorry.
We're very keen to disavow associations.
Why we didn't put our hand up?
No, but I was going to come to you. I wasn't going to neglect you, but I was going to start off on
Come to me later. I didn't put my hand up, but I was going to answer why.
Okay, but some of you who sort of do identify as that, why do you do that?
Well, I just do it because I'm at the moment, I started with the parish as a topic for my PhD research, but at the same time I was going to comment on and ask, or say at least that I believe it must be questioned as a whole, this parish. It must be problematized, like what does it mean, what are the boundaries, and is it important? So it for me a starting point, and I think it's a valuable starting point as it was a very important way to identify themselves in the past at least, and maybe now also. So I think it's a good starting point, but I would always question it to, well, there's competition in the religious field. There are monasteries, there's competition in social life, there are neighborhoods, there's families, there's the city. So.
But isn't that true for any single historical subject you study? That you know, there's always other things that need to be taken into account. Would you still not say that the parish takes sort of precedence among, among these that you just mentioned? I mean, in your own work, not
in my own work, it's a guideline to limit myself in a certain way, but and because it had an impact, and definitely it is something that formed a way of living. So it has a value, but I just think it should be continually put in question.
I wondered actually if you could replace the word parish with community, whether it would still hold its ground.
No.
Because because you have to talk about multiple communities, and when you're dealing with a single word of parish, is that sometimes the restriction that it comes under?
I don't think so, because because you can have a community that's larger than the parish, and you can have communities within a parish, but still this parish is a way to define a group or a place, so it stays interesting to see in which way the two fit or don't fit at all.
But this is kind of the value of what we're doing, isn't it? Like, it's a ridiculous generalisation, but if we're historians, what are we interested in? We're interested in reconstructing lived experience, lived religion for many of us, or different kinds of experiences. Which of course brings us to the question of to what extent the parish as an institution influences, shapes lived experience, consciously or otherwise, of our historical subjects. And it does in some contexts and at some moments more than others, even if the parish structure is more or less a uniform feature of life in Western Europe. I mean, the fact that it is uniform makes it a very interesting jumping off point for comparative history, for what parishes will look like and what people will get out of them in different contexts will be very, very different.
Let's comment on this as someone who once a long time ago wrote a study of a county, Sussex in the 17th century. I was just thinking about it as this conversation went on, that it was a study in a way of lots of parishes and how they related to each other. I'm picking up Peter's point about lived experience, what we've always all been interested in, I think, in one way or another. It's a question of approaches to that. And you can come to it through the parish or through other kinds of community. But there are limitations about the parish study. It's when you take parishes together and how they relate together and put them in governmental context or religious context or social economic context. In a way, parishes become more interesting in relation to each other.
But I think particularly when you're working on urban history, when we were hearing this morning about rural parishes, well, I think we may idealise them, but I mean, you can think of them geographically. But if you're taking a city like York, which in the late mid-80s had over 40 parishes, some of these parishes were half a street. And, I mean, it's patently obvious that, yes, these people in this street may have gone to this parish church, but they also probably went to the friary as well. And they belong to multiple communities, and therefore I think you can't stop at the parish if you're in a city or in an ancient city. I mean, somewhere like Hull had only got 3 parishes, or is it 2? Well, yes, technically not, in fact. But when you've got multiple parishes in an ancient city, I mean, you can't possibly sort of stay in your parish. You have to go outside it.
I've been involved in writing the volumes of the Staffordshire Victoria County history for quite some time, but I would say that I think I've become more of a parish historian in the past sort of 10 years or so, because the unit had always been a civil parish, but I think originally when I was just required to do sectional history, but in the past 10 years, mainly under the influence of a former joint editor, there's been a lot more emphasis on social history, and the religious history sections have been much more showing how the church has been presented. And I've got a very strong sense in the past 2 volumes I've been responsible for that I've got a much greater sense and awareness of developing a parish history, which I hadn't before. So I think the more recent volumes of the Victoria history, which is still ongoing, is, if you haven't consulted them, I think you will notice quite a major difference, which, as I say, is principally one of the consequences of the general editorship of someone along the end of the row here. It's been a major change.
I don't have a dialogue in that, but just to say that, that's very interesting, I think, because the VCH in its long-term history started as being about manors.
Yes.
And that was the crucial unit, the manor, not the village or the parish. And certainly I was very keen, and you were involved in these discussions, in moving a bit from manors to parishes and therefore communities. And that's why the religious aspect, which used to be just the church building,
and the Anglican Church.
In the Anglican Church, and broadening that out, and the economic and the social history, has broadened your concept of the village and the parish.
Well, there are now social history sections of the parish articles. I also have a social welfare section, which I've been able to, I don't know whether anybody else did any other county, because I just do what I want to do, but something I've been allowed to develop. So it's been very, very helpful, and bringing things like medical history, which we've never been allowed to do 20 years ago.
I wouldn't deny for a second that people have multiple, identities and loyalties, etc. But I think if you ask a pre-modern person about their primary identity, I think, they would say I'm a parishioner. Because that's where I'm baptized, that's where I'm buried, and that's where I, testamentarily speaking, if you had to sort of balance it, I live in all these different contexts, but I think if you boil it down to it, what is the strongest? I would say they're parishioners.
That's not what a typical Irish person would tell you. They belong technically to a parish, and they might want to be buried there. So in fact, they're more likely to want to be buried in a friary. So I mean, that works in some contexts.
That's right.
But it doesn't work in others.
I'd be inclined to also, for say Italy, it might need some modification. You would probably find that an urban Italian in the late Middle Ages would probably identify most strongly with their city, because in a city like Florence, where are people baptized? Well, in fact, the parish churches don't have baptismal rites. Only the cathedral does, and so the vast majority are actually baptized in the central baptistry. So there are sort of modifications, as well as the mendicant issue that's been mentioned elsewhere.
And then you can also go into cross-cultural areas. I'm selfish here and hold it back to Bolzano for a moment, but you can be baptised at the main parish church, but then working an urban church, San Giovanni in Villa, had baptismal rites. So sometimes there are little occasions where it slips through, but then it's way up on the Alpine areas. That's a little bit more out there, but quite right. It would be an Italian city-state, and you're.
There was just one person at the back, and then Peter.
I have very much enjoyed hearing the European perspectives that we have on parish studies here, and also a mention of theory, spatial and cultural theory, because I think there is a slight danger with parish history and local history of the triumph of empiricism. I very much remember sitting at another conference, nothing to do with Warwick parish studies, but a lot of the papers were about churches and a particular kind of art, various kinds of artefacts in churches, and seeing at the end the astonishment on the faces of the European historians that most of the papers were narratives, and that we didn't, I think, give ourselves time in papers often to develop any kind of theoretical approaches to our material. I think there are lots of reasons for that. One is the rise of digitisation, and sometimes we're just overwhelmed with the material there is. I think the changes in the teaching of history and local history, the low value put on local history in universities is a pity, but maybe it would be good sometime to have a symposium where we really could develop theoretical approaches more to our material.
Well, I would say that's certainly why I've been hesitant in saying that I am a parish studies historian, because I do approach my work in a very theoretical way. I think about not necessarily the parish as a whole, but I'm actually zoning in on the church as the space where community came together, where the laity came together and to fight the monks, that's a form of community identity, and it's also a form of collective memory. So while I am zoning in on the parish, parish studies I felt like did require more of that empirical approach. And while I am in the archives and I'm looking at the positions of the conflict, I'm also doing historical ethnography and asking people about how they imagine their parish community and how they relate to this past and imagine a continuity that obviously is untenable to say exists, but yet they are very interested in making the past very present in their community today. That requires a theoretical approach that I sometimes haven't been able to figure out if it does fit into parish studies, and you can certainly tell me that. But that's why sometimes I don't use that phrase.
I'm sorry, Peter.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask Kit French to tell us why the author of The People of the Parish doesn't self-identify as a historian of the parish.
Because I come from the US, where I don't think parish is as meaningful a unit. It's not an administrative, secular unit the way it is here. So when you say you're studying the parish or the medieval parish, you know, a lot of people don't know what I'm talking about, and those who do think, oh, how cute, that's pretty history, and it's sort of a patronizing response, which I don't think does justice to, you know, what I do. So I identify first as a medievalist, an English medievalist, and then I tend to say, depending on who my audience is, I study communities or, you know, peasants and townspeople in their religious practice. I mean, I don't disown that I'm studying religion as practice. But the unit of parish is either unknown or loaded in all kinds of sort of BBC Jane Austen-y kinds of ways that I don't really want to sort of get involved in.
In Berksville, I came across the word parish first because there was this group of people and they were complaining because £9,000 parish money had been spent on the driveway of the church. Well, I come from New Zealand, and the parish that you belong to is the church you belong to. So I just sat there, and I couldn't understand why they were complaining, because I thought that was what parish money was for the church. So whereas here, obviously, you know, it's a geographical unit, and I think today it's got quite confused in the minds of modern-day people, because they don't actually think the church has got anything to do with the parish.
But what's the real community? Because there are boundaries, and the boundaries were fixed in the 8th century when the tithe became compulsory. But people are going to the church, and in the church you see that the divisions, the social divisions are maintained, and when they come out, there are quarrels, they fight each other. I have a case of a parish with an exclave, a sort of island in the midst of another parish. And the people who were living there were obliged to pay the tithe to their mother church, but they went to the services in the parish which surrounded their enclave. So they were part of that community as a living being. So,
if we use the expression parish studies, do we mean anything in terms of time period? Does it have a terminal date? I mean, most of the papers we got this weekend are certainly not later than the 18th century. I think very few of us go into the 19th century. Can we see it as an expression which is valid into the 19th century with more urbanisation, with more people not part of the established church, with eventually local government in a lot of areas of the country moving away from parishes? Do we see it as something that can go forward to wherever we want to go forward to in date?
Yes, I would add to that, that even between the 16th century and the 18th century, we've got a few problems if we're looking at it in terms of identity. Well, just to think of my own village, you know, by the end of the 17th century you've got Quakers, you've got a Quaker meeting house. By the middle of the 19th century you've got Methodists. I mean, it's the breakup of the unity. Yes, your definition, your whole point about identity, is fine with the parish church in the Middle Ages. After that, after the Reformation, it's much more complex, isn't it?
I would also say you can break down, if you like, the meaning, the significance of parish at different times. Now, in the Middle Ages, I'm ready to say people, when they came to think of burial, didn't think of a particular plot in a churchyard as being the place that they would be buried in. I used to be absolutely sort of blanket in my view of that, and then years ago actually I edited a journal called Church Monuments, and someone sent in an article about grave markers in Kent, and he had gone round Kent churchyards and churches looking for what he had identified as medieval 13th or 14th century headstones, and there proved to be dozens of these, which completely threw me, and I don't think that's something of which the implications have ever really been taken on board, and for quite what the churchyards of Kent looked like in the Middle Ages, if there were far more of these and maybe wooden headstones. And I did at one time start looking at wills for mention of wooden headstones, if you can call them that. But still, overall, it must be, I suppose, that churchyards in the Middle Ages were not mostly divided up into owned plots, but at some point in maybe the 16th century or maybe the 17th, I am totally ignorant, the church wardens or others of the parish were able to assert ownership and divide up the land and then sell it. And that led to the flowering of the sited headstone in the 18th and into the 19th centuries. And then, I suppose, in the 19th century, at least in urban parishes, you began to find that there was no space, that there were ideas about sanitation, and there were creations of specific burial grounds and so on. And the significance of all of that is that the identity of the parish as including the place where you, your parents, your relatives were buried, went. And we today wouldn't think of burial place as crucial to our thinking of what makes up a parish. But this was clearly, perhaps, different in the 18th century and into the 19th. So that's burial place, the location of graves, is one aspect of what made up a parish.
More than that, the burial place is the legal definition of a parish. Because even if you're going to a chapel of ease, which is half a mile down the road, and you have to cross 3 rivers to get to your parish church, that has the right to the burial place.
It's an element of a bundle of rights, if you like, that makes up. I mean, in the 12th century, the word parochia was a whole group of things, and then
but it does not seem
the rights could be broken down.
Disputes as to whether a church is a parish church or not.
It's one aspect, yes. You could have a non-parochial church with burial rights. But
I mean, on the headstones issue, I mean, I think there are quite a lot of early modern wills which do seem to suggest that there are markers. And there are also episcopal visitations through the 16th and 17th century which complain about clutter and that there are far too many markers. One thing I think which might help to square the circle of people also kind of playing cricket and messing around is actually that people have been very predominantly on the south side of churchyards, and the north has been kept relatively clear of burial.
Yes, I'm always suspicious a bit about, there is a sort of Victorian mythology that the north side is for criminals and illegitimates and so on, and I tend to sort of brush that aside as mythology, but I'm sure you're right that there is an underlying element. But my point
sorry, there's just one point over here and then Valerie, but can I just have a quick plug actually, since we're talking about this, but the European Reformation Research Group conference in September is going to be on the theme of death, dying and burial, so if people want to talk about that, then please, send me an abstract at some point for that. But, yeah.
And the parish remains as a very important concept throughout the 19th century. I mean, it begins to shift a bit, but not very much in relation to tithe, poor law, and the poor law shifts to be unions of parishes, doesn't it? And certainly, if you're thinking about London of all places, until, 1900, the parish is the basis of the government of London. And parishes become in 1900, 1899, I can't remember which it is, the boroughs. And the boroughs that we now have in London are only amalgamations of ancient parishes. So it's a very, very powerful unit, I think, throughout the 19th century.
I return to burials. Church wardens during the 17th century were spending quite a lot of money on paving graves. These are not graves in the church because they're listed separately, but paving graves. So some marker of some kind was being put over the bodies.
I think it's quite interesting when we're thinking already this idea of the gravestones brings us to like the fabric of the church, because we often talk about parish churches being just in terms of community, the documents are held, but these are also fabric, they're architecture, they're the artworks that are actually contained inside, and one must always keep the holistic viewpoint on this, that the other disciplines coming in to help us understand, whether it's through the wall paintings, through sculpture. And I think also just when we've been trying to bring so many communities together here today about conservation and long-term care, about helping people understand the artworks that are, and the architecture that are there, surviving still today, the living church, and how the young scholars here that feel like, do you feel like you're making a contribution into this longer dialogue? Because reinvigoration has been a theme, I feel like it's been coming out of a lot of people's papers and sessions about how the church is always renewing itself. And where your scholarship kind of feels like, you feel like, particularly with the other art, the aspect of the fabric of the church, I mean, it feels it needs to get its due importance. Maybe Agata might be, she's signaling here.
Listening to all your comments, and especially your question about, you know, where does that stop? What time? What was the time frame of parish studies? And now I want to ask you, John, whether for next year you would accept a paper on a modern Polish parish, life and culture and history and art history, because your comment about the complaints of parishioners reminded me of the stories that I hear from my home parish. People, well, I live in my family in Poland lives in a rural area, and this parish identity is much ingrained in people's minds, and all these ideas are still alive even in the heads of people of my generation, and people discuss of their burial spaces. If you go into the Polish graveyards, you have labels on empty spaces, like saying busy or this will be mine at some point. And so it just depends on the community, probably. There's so much to say about parish.
I think it still is, yes, very much. I'd have to say, yeah, like my grandmother still very much defines herself by her parish and belonging to the parish guild, and so on. So I think there definitely is that opportunity to say that it's still a modern living aspect, and the care of the church. We've had so many great papers today about how communities are actually caring for the fabric of their church, that we actually have to rediscover, reconnect with it, the importance, and it's bringing in, connecting academy with those who are in care, those who care for the fabric and the monuments, the lifespan of the church that is so important here, that we do come together like this in order to share our knowledge and understanding so that we can ensure its continuity. Surely continuity for the future is actually one of the most important things, that we've still got those churches standing for us to talk about longer. You know, we have to make sure we care for the actual physical monuments there. So it's
No, I know there are people still trying to get in, but I mean, maybe we should sort of bring things to a close there. I mean, one of the things that we anticipated coming out of this session, out of the weekend, and I think has done, is sort of the idea of an extramural approach to the parish, that is sort of breaking beyond the bounds of the parish church into other spaces, breaking beyond the bounds of traditional disciplines to look at other sort of disciplinary perspectives, breaking beyond the walls of academia to look at other sort of heritage contributions and how we can establish dialogues with people in other sectors. Maybe the last set of walls that we should break out of today are the ones of this lecture theatre. We've been here for a while now, but maybe if you just join me in thanking yourself for your contributions and also our panel.